Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast with me, Holly.day, and one of my favourite people to talk about politics with, Cameron.garrett. Hey, Cameron.
That's very nice of you to say.
I'm only saying that because Kieran's not here, and that's because he's on a nice sunny holiday in Malta at the exact time that we've got yet another record-breaking poll out, haven't we? What are the numbers telling us this month?
Yeah, so following last month's record-breaking poll, we've broken the record for the lowest Tory vote share that Ipsos has ever polled in 45 years of doing surveys. So we have Labour on 44%, Conservatives on 19%, breaking their record from 20% low last month. We have Reform on 13%, which we'll come back to, Lib Dems on 9%, Green on 9%, and then other parties on 6%. So giving Labour a 25-point lead. So I think it's so obviously record low. Let's talk about that. That's not great for the Conservative Party, and it kind of shows they need to be, lots of people talking about the polls narrowing, and that doesn't seem to be happening. They seem to be at rock bottom and digging further down. And then also Reform's quite interesting, Holly. I think you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the way different pollsters ask these questions does differ, and the way we actually ask about voting intention is we don't prompt for Reform, so that means they're not on the list of options that we give people. So that 13% is quite high for us because it's not available on the list of options for people to choose. So that's people unprompted telling us that they would actively vote Reform, and that's the highest vote share that we've had for them in our polling so far. And they're within 6 points now of the Conservative Party on our political monitor. And I think, given the trajectory of the Conservative vote share, I mean, it's been relatively stable around the very low 20s. We've now dropped below the 20% mark. I think it's going to be interesting in the coming months if that Reform number does continue to creep up, quite how close they do get to the Conservative Party vote share. If that drops another couple of percentage points and the Reform vote share increases a couple of percentage points, you're in the territory where they're kind of almost neck and neck, and you've got to think that's pretty fertile ground for someone like a Nigel Farage, who is sat either at home or in the GB News studio, probably looking at this, potentially trying to time a bit of a comeback and see when it might be a good time for him to get involved. And I think you might see, if that Reform number does keep creeping up and gets close to the Conservative Party, I can't see him not being tempted to get involved at that point. But thinking more about the voting intention overall with that 25-point lead, we've talked on this podcast previously about where the Conservative Party ratings sit comparably to Rishi Sunak's personal ratings, and his ratings are actually looking pretty bad as well this month, aren't they?
Yeah, I think we need to ring the record-breaking klaxon twice in one political monitor. So yeah, Rishi Sunak's ratings. Last month, we spoke about him entering the -50 club, and he's just about still in it. He's got 16% satisfied with him, 9% say they don't know, and 75% dissatisfied. So if you're quick at maths, he's in it by the skin of his teeth on -59. So very close to the -60 club, which only has one member. Do you know who it is, Holly?
Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, so he's very close to joining Jeremy Corbyn in the -60 club. On -59, he's equal to John Major's worst ever satisfaction rating that Ipsos collected for him in the mid-1990s. I think it was August 1994 from the top of my head. So he's not in good company for prime ministers if you consider John Major went on to lose to Tony Blair in a landslide. Not saying Keir Starmer was Tony Blair, we'll get onto that. And then also following Jeremy Corbyn being on -60, we had Boris Johnson's landslide. So things aren't looking good for Rishi Sunak. And we're at the point where it's kind of, this would be terminal. The Conservative Party usually would have got rid of them. They usually lose a leader if they're around -45, but they've gone through so many now, I think they're hesitant to.
And it's worth saying, because we get asked this quite a lot when we release this polls, like, surely Rishi Sunak's numbers can't be worse than Liz Truss's. Well, in fact, like, they are. Her lowest rating was at -51. Obviously, she didn't stick around for a particularly long time, so that could have got lower if we'd have managed to actually run more polls on her if she'd have stuck around a bit longer. But as you said, the company that he's in record-breaking low territory and almost entering that -60 club consistently at this point, and it's been getting worse over the past few months, is not great for him. Also, even amongst Conservative voters, his satisfaction scores being squeezed. He's still in the net positive, I think, at +14 amongst Conservative 2019 voters, but we even see that number squeezing amongst his own supporters.
They're the people that are still saying they'll vote for him. They're the 19%.
That's the 19%.
Which is very low. So these people are the people that really, really support the Tory party, probably would never change. And they're still kind of divided on him.
Yeah, and I think moving on to Labour then, Starmer's numbers have obviously, well, not obviously, but in the past few months, he was hanging around the kind of net zero territory with his net satisfaction scores, doing pretty well as well amongst 2019 Labour supporters. But I think we've got another record-breaking klaxon to ring, haven't we, with his latest net satisfaction scores?
Yeah, so he's now on -31, which is the lowest we've ever had him while he's been leader of the opposition. It's not the lowest for a leader of the opposition. Obviously, we've just spoken about Jeremy Corbyn being on -60. And it's kind of weird to be talking about how bad Keir Starmer's satisfaction ratings are when he is, for all intents and purposes, got a 25-point lead over the Conservative Party. But at -31, when you look across the data and see where other leaders of the oppositions were at a similar point in their leadership, really, Keir Starmer's level pegging with Ed Miliband at the same time. He was on around -34 from memory, and William Hague was on about -32. So he's keeping the company of leader of the oppositions who went on to be election losers, essentially. But obviously, context is everything, and your opponent is everything. He still is 30-point lead over Rishi Sunak's satisfaction rating.
And that's the point, I think, isn't it? Even though he's broken the record of the lowest score that we've had for him, it's the context of who he's facing, and he's facing a guy who's got the lowest score for him and almost for anyone ever. Yeah. And you've only got to beat the opponent in front of you. So you can be lingering around -31, but if Rishi Sunak's hanging around the -60 mark, then it's actually maybe not looking as bad as it might be reported. And when we look at them facing off against each other in terms of personal characteristics, we measure on a bunch of things like being capable as a leader, being honest, more style over substance, understanding ordinary people and being in touch. He's still ahead on the majority of those measures. I think a few months ago on the podcast, we talked about him being ahead on every measure, and that has slipped slightly. So there's a few where they're kind of almost neck and neck or within the margin of error, but there's some particularly big leads on things like being out of touch with ordinary people. Starmer's got a 29-point lead against Rishi Sunak on that measure. Also on being more style than substance. I mean, neither of them are really renowned for being more style than substance, I would say, given Trainergate recently.
Yeah, did you see his, what are they, Sambas?
Yeah, I'm not up enough on trainer brands. I'm out of touch on trainer brands, I think, with ordinary people. Definitely. But his capability as a leader as well is an interesting one, because obviously Rishi Sunak is and has been the Prime Minister for some time now, and the fact that Starmer has such a substantial lead over Rishi Sunak as kind of potentially being a better leader, I think is one of the measures that is probably going to worry Team Sunak. We also ask about
one of my favourite ones, has a lot of personality, where they are neck and neck. 17% say Sunak has a lot of personality, and 16% say Starmer.
Yeah, it gives me confidence for Britain's future is a pretty bleak one as well. Like, there's not very many optimistic measures in this. I think it would be good to look at things like the Economic Optimism Index next month when we get that data out, and also the data on how the parties are faring when Political Pulse comes out in a couple of weeks. We do see, though, that when we ask who would be the most capable Prime Minister, Starmer now outflanks Rishi Sunak by 2-1. So 44% think Starmer would be the most capable Prime Minister, and not in great territory for Rishi Sunak, only 22%, even though he is currently the Prime Minister. And that is a measure that's been kind of following the same trajectory for some time now, hasn't it? And when we look back at previous Prime Ministers and the leaders of the opposition, when you get to this sort of territory of a continuous trend, that tends to be where either the Tory party kicks them out in the case of the past few, or the electorate kicks them out as and when there's an election, right?
I think what is interesting about the most capable prime minister question is, yeah, Keir Starmer has a 2-1 lead. Like, that's great for him. Like, those numbers, let's not lie about it, they're good numbers for him. But we have 1 in 5 saying neither, which is one of the highest we've measured in that question in about 10. We've been measuring it for since 2007. So I think that also does point towards that Keir Starmer hasn't necessarily like sealed the deal. There are people who just have apathy to politics, and both of them, I would say.
Yeah, and that's interesting again when we ask, okay, if people are saying neither, then do you fancy a change of leader before the next election for both parties, both
Not
Conservative
another one,
and
to quote
Labour?
Brenda from Bristol.
And actually 37% of people do say they want the Conservative Party to change their leader, which is kind of more than say they don't want that to happen, only slightly. The Labour Party is kind of flipped, so 35% say they'd like a change of leader versus 37% who don't. But I think that kind of points to the fact that there's not that much appetite, I would say, for another leadership change in advance of the next general election. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think people want to see much more change. And when you do poll the people who are in the Conservative Party who are still in Parliament and could potentially take over from Rishi Sunak, the one person that has a better number over him is Penny Mordaunt, but she's got 25% picking her as the most capable prime minister. So we're talking about a 3-point lead over. When you think about what the strains of being prime minister would then be and where that number might head, it's like, is it worth it? And then, yeah, so Keir Starmer still has a 17-point lead over her. And then against all of the people, basically, he has a very strong lead. So Priti Patel, he has a 35-point lead over. James Cleverly, 29 points. Suella Braverman, 35 points. Grant Shapps, 33 points. And Kemi Badenoch, 34 points. So we can talk about maybe the numbers narrowing slightly, but to be honest, he's got a convincing lead over all of them.
Yeah, and given the fact that he's got, what, a 22-point lead over Sunak on a similar measure on who'd make the best prime minister, the fact that when you poll other options and it comes out worse probably indicates that that's not the best way to go. That's not saying that that won't happen, because, you know, the past couple of years of history tell us that that's, you know, there's a distinct possibility that it could. And I think with the local elections coming up in the next few weeks, that's something I'm going to be looking out for, because there's been, obviously, people have been trying to get the Prime Minister to name a date for the election. He ruled out the same date as the locals. Some people, some commentators have kind of been saying, well, if it goes really badly, will he be forced to do it at that point? Or if it goes really badly, will he then just stick around? Will there be a leadership challenge? Or conversely, if it goes kind of better than expected, and I'm not entirely sure what that would look like, depending on your expectations, but if it goes better than expected, will that then give him a bit of a boost for people to stick with him? Or will that mean that he thinks, right, well, on a bit of a high here, might call an election? So I think there's still kind of endless possibilities in the next couple of weeks, depending on how those local elections go, as to what might come next. But what do the public tell us about when they want a general election? Because we do continue to ask people that, regardless of whether the Prime Minister's given us an answer as to when or when it may not happen.
Yeah. So we have 42% saying as soon as possible before the end of June, and we have 10% saying July or August. So when we add those two together, you've got a majority, 52%, saying they want a summer election. I'm sure lots of canvassers and door knockers would like that, get their tan on, knocking some doors, putting leaflets through. But yeah, as you say, I think Rishi Sunak has been pointing towards the second half of the year if he does get to make the choice himself. And you do get around 1 in 4 saying around September or October, 10% saying November or December, and then 7% who must just be gluttons for punishment are saying January 2025.
Oh, God.
Which, I hope not to be polling over Christmas.
Yeah, well, this is exactly why Kieran's gone off on holiday now, isn't it? Because 52% of people are telling us they want a summer election, and if you factor in 6 weeks of a campaign, that means it'd have to be called pretty soon after the locals, wouldn't it? Which is still a distinct possibility, but would interrupt many of my plans, and I'm sure yours as well.
Yeah. And to pick up on what you were saying, one world where I can see maybe the locals, he does what he wants to call the election is, I mean, I don't think you would do it when you have a 25-point deficit in the polls, but say there have been some polls out who are saying some different things around the West Midlands election, for example. One shows Labour winning, one shows it quite tight with Andy Street. If Andy Street does pip that against kind of all odds, you might feel like the narrative that night shows Labour didn't do a clean sweep, the Labour being overhyped, and actually he might try and go off the back of some of that optimism. I don't think that would work for him, considering Andy Street has kind of been a vocal opponent of him. And also it might point to issues around, look, Andy Street's been a vocal opponent of like HS2, etc., and kind of stood up to government, and he's managed to win his seat. What does that say to other Tory MPs who are still in Parliament clinging on to their seat? Oh, I can win it if I put myself in opposition to my own government, potentially. So yeah, lots of fun challenges we've got to see playing out over the next month or so.
Yeah, the mayorals are definitely going to be super interesting. I mean, it's something I'm personally very interested in, being a bit of a devolution nerd and a northerner. I think there's 10 mayorals at this time. We've got a new voting system, which I won't bore people with the details of, but it might, in theory, make it a bit easier for people. But there's a couple of new moralities that are up for election for the first time as well in the East Midlands and York and North Yorkshire. So there's kind of not been precedent in those places, and some of them are in really interesting constituencies. And they've all obviously got local factors at play as well. The same in the North East with Ben Houchin. So it's going to be really interesting if name recognition gets some of these people over the line, or if the Conservative brand causes a bit of a problem. But that's all something to look out for in the next podcast when we have a bit of a local elections look ahead and special. So keep an eye out for that. We'll also probably have some fun and interesting polling data coming out in the next couple of weeks around these sorts of topics. So keep an eye out for that. And in the meantime, we'll wait for Kieran to come back from holidays and talk about our next record-breaking poll in a couple of weeks' time. So thanks, Cameron, for having a chat. Like, subscribe, share wherever you get your podcasts. Do send us any questions if you've got anything you want us to cover as well. And we'll see you soon.